My name is Mark Skriners, and here's my amateur video to teach you about the American Revolution. This video will give you a basic timeline before, during, and after the American Revolution so that you have a basic foundation upon which to build further research and knowledge of what you know about the American Revolution. So, let's get started. Okay, this whole thing starts after Britain's victory in the French and Indian War, which had lasted from 1754 to 1763. Britain had run low on money, so they needed to collect more taxes in order to make up for the lost revenue. So they turned to the American colonies. They passed a succession of different taxes upon the American colonies: the Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, and the Townshend Acts of 1767, which increased tensions between the British and the American colonies due to the lack of representation by the American colonies in Parliament, eventually culminating in the Boston Massacre on March 3rd of 1770. March 5th, actually. After that, things died down for a bit. Then in 1773, the British passed the Tea Act, and the Americans responded with the Boston Tea Party on December 16th of 1773. The British responded to that with the Intolerable Acts in the next year, which put the British in direct control of Massachusetts as a colony, shut down Boston as a port, and quartered British troops in American private homes, among other things. The Americans then gathered delegates from the different colonies in the First Continental Congress in order to petition their grievances to the British, none of which, unfortunately, were of any measurable success. And in time, tensions continued to grow over the next year and over until finally armed rebellion seemed like a very, very likely option. So Americans began training their militias, gathering weapons, and then on April 18th, William Dawes and Paul Revere rode out to alert the American militias that the British were coming. And the next day, when the British went out to seize weapons at the town of Concord, they were briefly delayed at the town of Lexington by American militias who stalled them. It was during that somebody fired a shot, so-called shot heard round the world, and the British were able to disperse the militia right after and march on to Concord, where more American militia stopped them and drove them back to Boston, where they were harassed the entire way by Americans shooting at them from behind trees and rocks and bridges and such. After that, the city of Boston was officially under siege by American militia, although more officially it was laid under siege when, after a Second Continental Congress was formed, that then built the Continental Army that sent it under the direction of George Washington to Boston, where the city was then laid under siege until March of the next year in 1776, when the British were finally driven out. There were several altercations during that time, most notably the Battle of Bunker Hill on the date of June 17th of 1775. During this time, there were several other incursions, such as the Americans taking Fort Ticonderoga, having a failed incursion into Canada, and the British subsequently having a failed attempt to march into the South by attacking Charleston, South Carolina. And after the British left Boston, the American Second Continental Congress then had to decide what to do next. They were in open rebellion, they had defied the British Crown, they had killed British redcoats, and so in the end, following on a debate that had been started by Thomas Paine in his famous pamphlet Common Sense, they decided to enact independence. They wrote, signed, and adopted the Declaration of Independence as of July 4th, 1776, which is now America's Independence Day. And after that, the British decided to respond in August by attacking the city of New York. George Washington was there fortifying his position, but unfortunately he failed to hold back the British, and thus by September of that year, the British occupied the entirety of New York City and had driven George Washington, badly beaten, into New Jersey. George Washington fled across the Delaware, but then sneaked back in late December and early January to score victories at the cities of Trenton and Princeton, giving the Americans a desperately needed boost in morale. During this time, the British then pushed forces in through New York in order to try to cut off New England from the rest of the American colonies, whom they perceived as being the most rebellious. However, several issues arose in their strategy from armies either not moving or being delayed by the soldiers, and the primary force, led by General Burgoyne, coming south from Canada, got attacked multiple times by American troops and eventually was defeated and was forced to surrender at the Battle of Saratoga. In the meanwhile, one British general, General Howe, marched across New Jersey and successfully captured America's largest city, Philadelphia, at the time, which had also served as Congress's capital. But the Battle of Saratoga was a very powerful victory, and it paved the way for eventually a formal alliance with France, and thus giving the Americans a badly needed boost in financial support and international recognition. In that year, in the winter of 1777 to 1778, George Washington settled in Valley Forge in Pennsylvania, where he could keep an eye on the British in Philadelphia and New York. And it allowed him to also rest his troops despite a very brutal winter, and with the help of a Prussian general, Count von Steuben, train his troops and bring them up to speed and discipline on par with European armies like the British. When summer came round, General Howe abandoned Philadelphia, and along the way, George Washington intercepted him in the Battle of Monmouth, where, although the battle came to a draw, it proved that the Americans could fight in open fields and on equal terms with the British and hold their own. After all this, the British shifted their priorities south, moving and taking the city of Savannah in Georgia, soon thereafter taking over the entirety of the state of Georgia, then moving north into Charleston, after into South Carolina to take the city of Charleston after the Americans failed to take the city. In the meanwhile, also up north, there was some action as one British officer, John Andre, was captured, and it was revealed that he had been conversing with a noted American hero, Benedict Arnold, in order to have him surrender the fort of West Point to the British. This treachery was discovered, and thus Benedict Arnold to this day remains one of the most notorious American traitors. As things went on, then in 1781, the tide began to turn in the South after the British had taken Georgia and most of South Carolina after the British were defeated in the Battle of Cowpens. After that, General Nathanael Greene, controlling American forces in the South, harassed and battled the British General Lord Cornwallis throughout the Carolinas in the South in several battles such as Guilford Courthouse and Eutaw Springs, but unfortunately wasn't exactly having much success in defeating him outright, but was successful in whittling down his numbers, until eventually he maneuvered Cornwallis onto a narrow peninsula in Chesapeake Bay, where he was forced to take refuge in the town of Yorktown. George Washington then took his army and moved south to lay siege to Cornwallis. The British Royal Navy attempted to relieve Cornwallis by sea, but the French Navy was there and kept them away, and thus successfully bottlenecking and trapping Cornwallis right on that narrow peninsula. And so George Washington slowly closed the lines in until finally he had forced Cornwallis to surrender on October 19, 1781. With the surrender of a second British army and the only other British army being up north in New York, the American cause was all but wrapped up and successful. And so over the next 2 years, the Americans retook South Carolina and Georgia, while George Washington refocused a large army around New York, keeping the British trapped there. All the while, American, French, and British diplomats met in Paris to discuss in terms of the end of the war, finally culminating in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which gave the United States independence and recognized America's territory from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic Ocean. And eventually, on November 25th, 1783, the British in New York evacuated and allowed the United States to retake the city. And with that, the Revolutionary War was over. In the years after that, the United States set about building the United States government. They originally had the Articles of Confederation they had adopted in 1781, but it proved to be too weak to effectively govern the 13 states. So eventually, a constitutional convention was convened in 1787 to form a more secure and stronger central government that at the same time recognized the rights of the states. And over the next 2 years, after intense ratification battles, eventually the Constitution was finally ratified, and it led then to America's first presidential election, which saw George Washington elected President of the United States in that year. Following that, over the next 2 years, the United States would then add 10 amendments to the Constitution, known as the Bill of Rights, and that is pretty much the gist of the American Revolution. I can say more about the American Revolution. I could say a lot more, but that is all the time I have for today. In the meantime, check the description below for further resources that you can use to further develop your knowledge. Go and check out your local library. Go and check out any manner of resource you can find. Build up what you know, what you have about the American Revolution. Those who understand their past understand their future. It is very important to know about the American Revolution because it gives an understanding of what it means to be an American. Thank you and God bless, and I hope you learn a lot more. This video is just too short.